Joining me now from New Delhi is Chandra Bhushan. He is Deputy Director General for the Centre for Science and Environment. It's one of India's leading public interest research institutions. And from San Francisco, we are joined by Chris Field. He is the Professor of Environmental Studies at Stanford University. Both of you, welcome to the show. Chris, I just want to start with you. You were in Lima. It depends who you listen to. Is this agreement the first time that countries will have to come up with a plan to cut carbon emissions, or is it a fudge that actually makes global warming worse as we head to the Paris conference in 2015? What's your take?
This conference definitely didn't accomplish everything that people hoped, but it did accomplish three important things. It established the principle that addressing global warming is going to require contributions from all countries. It established the clear understanding that all countries will be impacted and there need to be resources for adapting to the climate changes that can't be avoided. And it also established a mechanism for recognizing that there needs to be compensation for damages. These are real solid accomplishments. They're not everything people hoped for, but they're important steps along the pathway to the ultimate solution.
Chandra Bhushan, is that your take, that some progress but not enough?
Quite the contrary, actually. It did establish that all the countries will have to take action, but whether all countries' action will add up or not, this conference actually makes it even difficult now that to add up and the aggregate impact of all countries' action, whether we will be able to maintain 2 degrees or not. The second thing is, actually this outcome that we had in Lima barely allows countries to talk for next year. You know, I was there in Lima. The talks extended for 33 hours, and the text that is out basically is good for big polluters. And therefore, big polluters can do whatever they want. The differentiation has been diluted. There is no commitment on finance and technology that developing countries will have to do. There is no mention of loss and damage, actually, in the final text. So on the contrary, what Chris said, I think this is a very weak outcome. It gives way for a lot of fights next year, and eventually a very weak outcome in Paris.
So let's break this down. You talked about 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the barrier where most climate scientists think that the world, if it continues to warm towards the next century, it will become irreversible. Ice caps will melt. You also talked about funding. There's been talk of $100 billion a year to be set aside for developing countries to cope with the costs of climate change, and also commitments from the big polluters to cut emissions. So, Chris, we're not anywhere near us, says Chandra. You seem to see the glass more half full at this stage.
You know, this is a long process. I don't disagree with any of the points Chandra raised, but it really is a kind of a glass half full, glass half empty. One of the things that's important to remember is that we're talking about big steps that need to be taken ultimately, and the real question is, do you get to the destination with 2 or 3 gigantic steps or with a number of small steps? I would love to have seen some big, bold steps, and we didn't see that in Lima. Totally agree with Chandra, but we did see incremental progress on some key issues. There's a lot of work to be done between now and the Paris conference this time next year, but I think that the core issues have been opened up. Let me just say, the main thing that needs to be addressed and has not yet been addressed is the fundamental issue of fairness. How do you distribute the responsibility for the changes that need to be made?
Well, there was a big step just before this conference, wasn't there? China and the US basically came together and sort of squared the circle between developed and developing countries. China will peak emissions by 2030. The US will bring emissions down to an ambitious target, 26% to 28% of 2005 levels by 2020. So, you know, there was this give and take between the 2 biggest polluters. Why didn't that translate in Lima, Chandra?
First of all, I think we have to dissect US-China deal. I think US-China deal is a deal of convenience. The 26% that you're talking about US actually translates into about 12 to 13% reduction over 1990 levels. And by that time, actually Europe would cut by 40%. So actually US numbers are not at all ambitious. As far as China is concerned, it will peak by 2030, but at what level it will peak is the big question. It can peak at say, 20% increase from now, or it could double by 2030. So that's a huge uncertainty about the level at which China will peak. So both the two big polluters, the numbers that they have put on table, actually is a very weak number and allows a lot of countries not to do much. So, and that got reflected in Lima. Actually, US-China deal was at the back of the mind of a number of countries that if the two big polluters have not taken any bolder step, why should we? And that is reflected in the Lima agreement.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because let's bring up India. You're sitting in New Delhi. Everyone thought there'd be a lot of pressure on India after this China-US deal. But the consensus among environmentalists coming out is that India may not even need to sign on to reduce carbon emissions in Paris, and actually could even show to increase them beyond 2020, 2030, given the looseness of this deal. Chris, is that something you understand? And I'd like, Chandra, to address that from India, where you're sitting.
One of the things that is a disappointment coming out of Lima is that the structure didn't have more clarity about who's required to do what. I think that the frustrating situation where we're in now is that some countries, the US, China, the European Union, have made meaningful commitments, and the nature of the agreement coming out of Lima is that everyone's encouraged to do their best. I think the nature of this problem is that it requires some level of global coordination and not just each country making an investment in doing its best. And the real challenge moving forward is how to get from this vague, generally supportable goal of every country doing their best to something that really is going to have the teeth that are necessary in order to prevent the worst impacts of climate change.
Chandra, and I'd like you to address India as well in this answer.
So, first of all, we would not encourage India as an Indian environmental organization. We want India to have an ambitious target on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on improving the emission intensity of economy. I think there is huge co-benefit agenda for India to do, and therefore it will be our endeavor to make sure that India comes out with an ambitious target in Paris. Having said that, if what US and China is going to do, then frankly speaking, if those principles are applied, then no one in the world needs to do anything. It's not only about India. China is going to peak in 2030. US is talking about 12, 13%. Considering the kind of emissions they have right now and had in the past, you shouldn't be asking even Brazilian and South African to do anything. Okay, so the principle that has been put out, as I said in the beginning, is actually a very self-serving, I want this, and that's the principle that is there.
Chandra's really articulating extremely well this difference between developing countries and developed countries, where there is this tremendous feeling in developing countries that you, the developed countries, had your industrial revolutions, you polluted the planet, and now you want to shut the door before we've developed enough to catch up with you guys. Was there any progress on that sort of division in Lima, and can we see a win-win situation coming before Paris? Chris?
There was progress in Lima, and I think it comes in at least three important areas. One is a recognition that this idea of differentiated responsibility is still the foundation of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there is more to do for the developed countries that have had their opportunity to utilize vast amounts of fossil fuels. But there are also opportunities for other countries, and Chandra has very eloquently explained some of the opportunities for India. It's important to recognize that if we say there's a heavy lift for developed countries and developing countries don't need to do anything, that also runs the risk of locking developing countries into a future of inappropriate reliance on the dirtiest kinds of fuels. I think that the whole discussion about dealing effectively with climate change does need to be reframed in the context of the opportunities for coming up with creative solutions, for finding co-benefits and low-cost pathways. And I think that certainly a lot of the discussion in Lima was about that. A lot wasn't. This fundamental question of fairness, who makes the sacrifices, who makes the commitments, and who provides the financing to make the agreement move ahead are all critically important and still to be discussed. But I think that this fundamental idea that there's an opportunity for everybody to participate, and it doesn't necessarily mean sacrificing opportunities for development. It's really enabling opportunities for development around the world.
Chandra, you know, $100 billion is the amount that has been discussed that developed countries would give developing countries, or finance for them to make these changes from fossil fuels like coal to solar and wind and renewables. Do you think that's going to happen given the global financial environment? And do you think it's fair?
You know, first of all, I just want to respond to Chris saying we should not lock into high fossil fuel economy. But the fact is both US and China are locking themselves and the world on shale gas. If coal is bad, so is shale gas. So I think the locking into fossil fuel is not going to happen only in developing countries, but is already happening in developed countries that we need to make sure doesn't happen. And I'm not expecting much progress in finance in Paris or till 2020. I think it will be a tough task for developed countries to put $100 billion on the table. They have not done in the past, and I'm not expecting them to do in the future as well.
Let me round this out with a question for both of you. First for you, Chris. Given what we've seen in Lima, given what we saw in New York before and what we're expecting in Paris, is enough being done to stop the world from warming to catastrophic levels, this 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit that everyone's warning us about at the end of the century? Is enough being done?
The answer is no. We need to be more aggressive if we're going to have a reasonable chance of reaching a goal that stabilizes climate change at 2C or 3.6 Fahrenheit above pre-industrial and prevents the worst impacts of climate change. There's no question about that. But I can also understand why countries around the world, both in the rich world and the poor world, are very insecure about making major commitments to changing their energy systems. One of the really encouraging things about this new agreement between the US and China is it recognizes that there is a path forward to begin learning by making small steps and appreciating that there are opportunities and co-benefits. Until we begin to make that progress, I don't think it's realistic to ask everybody in the world to take a giant leap into what's essentially the unknown. Yeah. I hope that what we see between now and Paris is a series of incremental steps that increasingly lock down ambitions and raise the level of commitments.
Chandra, are you optimistic that this level can be met by the end of the century?
You know, no country in the world, and let me be very empathetic about it, that no country in the world has actually managed to reduce emissions. Neither Europe nor US. And therefore, we have not started even the process of beginning the process to reduce emissions. And the other point I want to make is that we have already lost 30 years of climate change negotiations. 1998 started. The world has committed very little till 2020. If we get a weak deal in 2030, we will lock the world for another 10 years. So 4 decades or 2 generations of lost opportunities. That's how we have to look at it. Now, if you lose 4 decades, by 2030, a lot will be lost. And therefore, it is important that from now till Paris, there is a sense that comes across the world that everyone will have to do. Developed countries will need to do a lot more than developing countries, but developing countries need not, back out. There is a big agenda for them to do co-benefit agenda, and that they should do. But if the ambition is less from developed countries, we are doomed. I think we are locking the world till 2030 with no action.
Chandra Bhushan in New Delhi, Chris Field in San Francisco, both not totally optimistic, but some progress, although incremental, in Lima.